So, welcome back to our next Petman Academy musicianship class. I hope you're all doing well and you've had a good first week back at school. Yeah, I hope you're looking forward to the weekend's Petman events. So last week we looked at the classical period, really important part of music history, and in particular we focused on the composer Joseph Haydn, Austrian, very big, important name in the history of music. He was very influential on a lot of later composers, one of whom was Ludwig van Beethoven. I've spoken about Beethoven quite a lot in previous years, and I'd like to spend a bit more time today, just for those of you who haven't been to or who weren't at my classes last year. This year is a particularly important year in Beethoven's history, as it represents the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. He was born in the year 1770 in the German city of Bonn, and prior to COVID-19 pandemic, of course, there was lots of big concerts, conferences and celebrations of Beethoven's music, Beethoven's life, to mark this really momentous occasion. Some of those have been postponed or delayed until later in the year or even into next year. So I still hope that there will be a big Beethoven celebration. It's just obviously not going to happen in the way that was originally planned, and many things won't happen for a while. But I'm sure we will still get to experience a lot of Beethoven's music in the coming years. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and show what I've prepared for today. So I'll just go ahead and do that. Okay, just bear with me. So I hope you can all see this. So today in particular, we're going to look at more on the classical period, and in particular talk a little bit about Beethoven's background and also look at his Fifth Symphony, which I'm sure a lot of you know already. And I'd also like to just reinforce the idea of sonata form, or the sonata principle, that I spoke with you about last time on Haydn's 26th Symphony. We're going to have a look at another couple of examples of that and see what Beethoven does. So, a little while ago when we spoke about Bach and Handel, I listed all the different periods of music history, and I put dates next to them. So music history, or Western music history I should say, really starts with the medieval period, then it moves into the Renaissance, then we ended up in the Baroque with Bach and Handel. The next two names on our list of musical periods, if you like, are classical and romantic. And today we're really going to put a foot in each camp. By that, I don't mean that we're going to really quickly rush through both, but that we're going to deal today with a man who arguably fits into both classical and romantic music, and also arguably fits into neither of these. And that man is, of course, Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, the reason why it's difficult to know whether to put Beethoven as a classical composer or a romantic composer is that, just like all labels for periods of history, terms classical and romantic don't simply represent a given number of years, but rather attitudes or beliefs of certain people. So the word classical is really referring back to the ancient classical civilizations of the Greeks, and it brings with it a sort of sense of formality, rationality, order, clarity, and wholeness. And composers themselves even wrote about such things, notably composers like Gluck, although incidentally they never used the word classical. This only came later. And central to the idea of music from the classical period is a strong sense of structure and form. So a lot of music has this sort of, from the classical period, has this strong structure and form. Composers liked to communicate clearly to their audiences and wanted them to be able to grasp and understand the way that music was written, so they would sort of know what the composer was trying to do. This meant that composers all used and reused the same ways of organising their notes. The same structures for piece of music, the same sorts of harmonic and melodic conventions, the same clues about where musical ideas started, finished, or veered off into unexpected directions. Everybody, composers, musicians, and audiences, found plenty to enjoy about these practices and found that they provided a rich source of imaginative potential because there was really quite a lot that you could do with all these ideas. Yes, the classical period had formality, rationality, order, clarity, and wholeness, but there was also playfulness, wit, pleasure, and surprise. So if you like, people were all speaking the same musical language, both the composer and the audiences, so they all got it when the composer did clever things. So for example, like when you think a piece of music is about to end, but then suddenly the harmony changes. That's only going to be surprising to you when you've heard the way it should or typically goes often enough to understand that the composer is deliberately surprising you. And Haydn was a very good composer at surprising his audiences. So the music of the classical period, it's really highly social in that it's a shared experience, shared between the composer, the performer, and the audience. Being in a room full of people listening to a new symphony in, say, the 1770s wouldn't be dissimilar to going to a movie today. All the people watching the movie, we're all reacting to the same cues. We're all laughing at the same jokes because we know why it's funny. We're all expecting the same outcomes because, you know, we've seen enough rom-coms, action flicks to know how the movie is supposed to end. And I'm not exaggerating this. You can look back at Mozart's letters that he wrote to his father, in which he describes this sort of behaviour at public concerts. So the description I've got on the left-hand side of this slide applies to composers like Mozart and Haydn. And what's more, a lot of that also applies to much music of the 19th century, of whom the Romantics were a very significant part. But Romantics also had ideas that were different to classical ideas. At the core of the Romantic ethos stands not the community, not this sort of social circle, not the fashionable in-crowd, but the individual. Music was more of a collective enjoyment in the classical period, while to the Romantics, it was more about solitude, solitary contemplation, being an individual. And this was both the case for listening to music, playing it, and composing it. So the Romantics valued originality, they valued individual expression, and they valued the genius. They turned their noses up at conventionality of the classical period, even though they still continued to use a lot of the structures and ideas that came from composers like Mozart and Haydn. They didn't compose music or paint or write poems in order to please others, but they composed to satisfy themselves, to satisfy their sort of inner impulse, to appease the unrest that was building within their souls. These artists sort of almost used their personal struggles and mitigated them by their struggle with their art. Every new work of art written in the Romantic period had a unique meaning, and every tiny little piece of that artwork was a part of what created that meaning. So Bach and Handel, on the other hand, would frequently reuse pieces of music that they'd already composed before. They might change the key, they might change the instruments, they might just change the title, and then, hey presto, they've got another piece of music. But Romantic composers wouldn't have been able to do that. Their music, their feeling was that the music had to be unique to the purpose. Romantics also had to work and rework, polish and repolish all of their compositions. For example, as I said last time, Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies, whereas Schumann, a Romantic, only wrote 4. Beethoven wrote just 1 opera in his lifetime, which took him 12 years, and he revised it 3 times. Rossini, who also lived at the same time as Beethoven, who was not a Romantic composer, wrote 2 or 3 operas each season. And there's a famous story, I'm not sure how true it is, that Rossini was lying in bed one morning writing an overture for a new opera when a gust of wind came in through the window and blew away what he'd written. Rather than get out of bed and pick it up off the floor, he just wrote another one instead. So no self-respecting Romantic could have ever have done that. The other 2 things about these terms is that they don't just represent time, but they also represent place. The classical style, although it was enjoyed across all of Europe, derives from the Italian style. Romantics, on the other hand, were principally German. So some music writers prefer to not call it classical and Romantic music, but write about 18th century music and 19th century music and separate them like that. It can be interesting to compare what people at the time said about their respective musics. In 1776, the music historian Charles Burney wrote this: "Music is an innocent luxury, unnecessary indeed to our existence, but a great improvement and gratification of the sense of hearing." In 1855, Franz Liszt wrote about how music embodied feeling and had this to say: "On the towering, sounding waves of music, feeling lifts us up to heights that lie beyond the atmosphere of our earth and shows us cloud landscapes and world archipelagos that move about in ever-real space like singing swans." Now, the thing about Beethoven is that we see both classical and Romantic elements in him. Many of Beethoven's works, especially the ones written earlier in his life, have a lot in common with the classical style. But at the same time, he stretched these ideas to the utmost so that his music could hardly fit within the bounds of the classical period anymore. So in this respect, he was really looking forwards towards a new era of music. Many of the various trends that later 19th century Romantic music took came from the advances that Beethoven made. So Beethoven was a very, very important turning point in the history of Western music. And he wrote in all the main musical genres of the day. For example, he wrote the solo instruments, such as the piano and violin. He wrote chamber music. He wrote symphonies, concertos, sacred choral works, that's religious choral works, and he wrote opera. And in all of these areas listed on this slide, he experimented so wildly that in the following years, almost every composer from through the 19th century could look back to Beethoven and say that they were influenced and inspired by him. I don't want to spend too long going into Beethoven's biographical details, but they are fascinating, and I do recommend that you read up on them a little bit. There'll be plenty that you can find online, especially in this 250th anniversary year. It's really interesting, in fact, to read about his background, his grandparents and parents, and his childhood. As a young man, Beethoven travelled to Vienna, where he took lessons from both Mozart and Haydn. And when Mozart heard Beethoven's music, he had this to say: "Keep your eye on him. One day he will make the world talk of him." And Haydn had this to say about Beethoven: "This young man will in time fill the position of one of Europe's greatest composers, and I shall be proud to be able to speak of myself as his teacher." But Beethoven, being a young, arrogant individual, spoke of Haydn in this way: "Haydn, from whom I learned absolutely nothing." Now, music historians will, of course, point out that this was, in fact, not true, and Beethoven did learn a lot and was very much inspired by Haydn's music. So today I'm going to look at a few examples from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and then next week we're going to continue by looking at his Sixth Symphony and Ninth Symphony. So I said beforehand that the classical period was particularly concerned with form and structure in music. And one of the most important of these structures is something that's come to be known as sonata form. I touched on this and explained what this was last time, but we're just going to look at it in the context of Beethoven and explain what this is again. Sonata form's a little bit misleading and can get very confusing because sonata is the name given to many pieces of music, and not every sonata is actually in sonata form. And then not every piece in sonata form is a sonata. So we do need to know what we're talking about. So don't worry if the terms get a little bit confusing. The word sonata literally means to sound, and it was originally used to differentiate a piece that's played on instruments from the word cantata, which of course means sing or sung. At some point, it came to mean a piece for a solo instrument, or a piece for a solo instrument with a piano accompaniment. So a piano sonata would be a piece for piano alone, while a violin sonata would usually be written for violin with piano as well. However, at various times in history, the word has been used more freely than that. Today, sonata form I'm actually going to refer to as the sonata principle. The sonata principle was a way that composers in the classical period constructed their works. It enabled them to write much longer compositions than had been previously written. It gave them a sense of direction and a sense of shape to their music. The form was capable of infinite variety, but it remains the basis of a huge amount of compositions that were written during the classical period and beyond. So I went through this last week, but I'll just reinforce this today. In simple terms, this is what happens. The music begins with the exposition, where the musical ideas or the themes or melodies of the movement are shown, or if you like, they're exposed. Then midway through the movement, we go into the development section. I'll explain the reason for this word a bit later, but essentially this was a middle section in which the music goes off and does all sorts of different things, apart from playing the melodies as we've heard them in the exposition. Then finally we come to the recapitulation, where the musical ideas of the movement are restated. Now I can illustrate this to you with a simple sonata movement by Mozart. His sonata in C major, K545, the first movement, that I expect many of the pianists amongst us here, learned to play at around grade 5. So a lot of you might be familiar with this. We're going to begin in the exposition with the first subject, and this is stated in the home key of C major. So here's the first subject, or the first theme, if you like. This is immediately followed by the second subject, which is not only in a different key, it's in G major, but it also has a contrasting character. So here's the second subject. Next, Mozart closes the first section and then begins the development by exploring the musical idea of the last few bars that we just heard and trying out a range of different keys, including minor ones. So here's the end of the exposition and then moving into the development section. we return to familiar territory in the recapitulation. In this case, it's almost an exact copy of the exposition, but it's reorganized so that it ends in the home key of C major. So first we hear the first subject again. And then we finish up with the second subject, which is now in the home key of C major. So here's that section. Now this sonata principle is the pattern that many of the movements from Haydn's and Mozart's sonatas, symphonies and chamber works are based on. Beethoven continues to use this sonata principle, but he stretches it to its limit. Beethoven often wrote works that are very long, so that tests the limits of a person's memory for what they've just heard. For example, Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, the first movement of that alone is longer than most symphonies were in their entirety at that time. Beethoven also really enjoys the development aspect of sonata form, and he sets himself up for this in his choice of musical ideas. If you think about Mozart's music, Mozart's famous for writing beautiful flowing tunes, just like this one that we just heard, but there's many, many more. Beethoven preferred to build his movements on much smaller fragments. And nowhere is this clearer than in his famous Fifth Symphony. So here, that first subject, the first theme, isn't really a tune like we heard in the Mozart, but it's more of a rhythmic idea. Da-da-da-dum. 3 short repeated notes followed by 1 longer note. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. And Beethoven's absolutely ingenious in the way that he builds an entire movement. This movement is about 10 minutes long on that one little rhythmic idea. So you've heard it once. Now I'd like you to listen again and count how many times you hear that da-da-da-dum theme. You can jot it down on a piece of paper and then you can check your answer when I reveal it afterwards. So here it is again. How many times do you hear that theme? What answer did you get? Well, the score shows 14 times in the first 20 seconds And in the whole of what we just heard, at least 36 times in the exposition of the first subject. So the answer, hopefully you got, was 36. Here they are. Then it happens very quickly. And it goes on like that. I'll show you the next page. So he's building this entire movement on that tiny little fragment. Short, 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 long. It's quite incredible how he manages that. And that brings us up to the end of the first subject in the exposition. So 36 times in total, I counted. After all that rhythmical stuff, the second subject, or the second theme, is a much more contrasting melodic theme. But Beethoven can't resist using his original theme here too. Have a listen to it sort of lurking in the background. And then later on comes the development section. In Mozart's sonata, he didn't play the main theme during this section, and nor does Beethoven in his. But he writes music that sounds similar. That is, he takes his initial da-da-da-dum motive and transforms it. To put it literally, Beethoven develops some of the potential of that motive. Notice how he keeps the rhythm, but changes the melodic shape. This wasn't a new technique. Haydn had been doing this for almost 30 years. But for Beethoven, it became more than a technique. It became a guiding principle. Indeed, Romantic composers really admired the way one single tiny little theme or motive could become the source for a whole big exploration of its different possibilities and how all its potential for development into different musical ideas could be exploited. That opening da-da-da-dum theme is a motive from which much of the movement unfolds. Romantic composers like to think of this in metaphors of growth. So that theme was the seed, and then the whole movement grows organically into flower. They still did often retain classical structures like the sonata principle, but they extended their possibilities and combined them with this organic approach. Likewise, classical composers such as Haydn also played around with the musical motives that they'd created. This detailed crafting and ingenious use of a tiny little musical idea enabled Beethoven to write much, much longer compositions than had previously been written. And at the time, in fact, one of the chief complaints about Beethoven's music was that his pieces were too long. Players and audiences found them long, strange, harsh, aggressive, and unpredictable. But composers who followed in this tradition included Brahms, who wrote some remarkable symphonies and claimed Beethoven as the inspiration for them. Beethoven dedicated the Fifth Symphony to two of his patrons, Prince Franz Joseph von Lobkowitz and Count Razumovsky. The dedication appeared in the first printed edition of April 1809, but the piece was actually first performed in 1808. And by this time, Beethoven's deafness had actually become quite bad. In fact, back in 1802, he was already going deaf, and he went out to sort of recover in the countryside just outside Vienna in a place called Heiligenstadt. And during his stay there, he had to some extent come to terms with his deafness. And he wrote about this in letters to his brothers, the most famous document being the Heiligenstadt Testament. Beethoven displayed a strong love for humanity and a desire to do good. Those are actually his words. And those thoughts are strongly expressed in his Ninth Symphony. But next time, we're actually going to come and look at his Sixth Symphony, first of all. And this was premiered in the same concert as the Fifth Symphony. They were part of a giant concert on the 22nd of December, 1808, at the Theater an der Wien in Vienna. Today, if you think about going to a concert, most concerts are about 90 minutes long. Typically, there's an overture, then a concerto, then an interval, and then that's followed by a symphony. Concerts today tend to showcase a range of different composers and musical styles. This concert in 1808, where both the Fifth Symphony and Sixth Symphony were premiered, contained only Beethoven's music. It was conducted by Beethoven himself and included the following works. So we have his Sixth Symphony, then we have the Aria a Perfido, opus 65, then we have the Gloria from his Mass in C, then we have the Fourth Piano Concerto with Beethoven himself as the soloist, then an interval, then we have the premiere of the Fifth Symphony, then the Sanctus and Benedictus from his Mass in C major, and then a solo piano improvisation performed by Beethoven himself. How amazing would that have been if we could go back in time and watch that? And then finally finishing with the Choral Fantasy. So the entire concert lasted for over 4 hours. That's quite incredible. But actually, a 4-hour concert was more or less normal for that time. Concerts back in 1808 lasted a lot longer than they do today, and they often did just showcase one composer's works. To finish things up, we'll just have a little look at a video that explains a little bit more about the premiere of that Fifth Symphony. So let's have a look at this. So, and incidentally, the music in the background of that was from the fourth movement of the Fifth Symphony. So I hope you enjoyed that session and learned a little bit about perhaps Beethoven's most famous work. Next week, we're going to continue to look at Beethoven's symphonies, but looking at the Sixth Symphony and the Ninth Symphony, two very, very important, highly influential works on the whole history of music for 200 years after that. We will also, in a couple of weeks' time, look at Mozart, but more from a perspective of him as an opera composer. So we'll have that to look forward to as well. So enjoy the rest of the weekend. Enjoy all the other Petman masterclasses and chamber music rehearsals. And I'll look forward to seeing you again on Zoom in a week's time. Thank you and have a good week. Bye-bye.
La la la, je ne l'ose dire. La la la, je ne vous dirai. Il